And good morning, everybody. I'm John OLoughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And so excited this morning. I can hardly wait to get started. So let me go right ahead and introduce our guest for this morning, the great author, Doug Valentine. Good morning, Doug.
Thanks for having me on the show, John. I hope I could contribute something.
Are you kidding me, man? After all of you've done, I'm sure that anything that you do will be a great contribution. This morning, I want to let everybody know that we're working with closed captioning. So there might be a slight delay between my question and Doug's answer, but other than that, we are ready to go. And Doug, I asked you yesterday, I said, what did you want to talk about today? What subjects do you think of all the things that you've covered that you really want to specify, to spend some time on this morning to maybe make sure our audience understands the message that you are trying to give with the books that you've written? And your answer was the two books, The Strength of the Wolf and The Strength of the Pack. Now, I've been reading portions of your books on my show for a number of months now, and my shelf here is almost half full of Doug Valentine books, by the way. But let me pull these three out because I think they kind of make a trio in a way. It's The Strength of the Pack, The Strength of the Wolf, and The CIA is Organized Crime. And as I was reading these books, I found that, there's this definite pattern here that's going on. And so let me ask you this. First of all, I noticed you took the titles from Rudyard Kipling. And Rudyard Kipling is a towering figure in British and English literary tradition, poetry. I mean, who hasn't read Gunga Din and Kim and the Jungle Book being the basis of so much of the Disney's characters? Why, Doug, let's start with this. Why did you choose quotes from Rudyard Kipling to form the title of your books?
Well, of course, there were multiple reasons, and it was a good phrase, and it covered both. To my way of thinking, it brought together both the domestic and the international aspects of the narcotic trafficking and the federal drug law enforcement response to it. And it brought into the picture language. It shows how language, and Rudyard Kipling was a master of language, and he was actually a propagandist for the British government, and he was masterful with his way of humanizing empire and making it attractive to people. So there's that aspect of it, which is it becomes a literary vehicle for showing how a master craftsman like Rudyard Kipling can be manipulating us without us even knowing it. Including children. Children read a lot of Rudyard Kipling's books, and one of his strongest features was being able to lead children's minds in a particular direction that was compatible with the interests of the British Empire, and create, in that sort of propagandistic way. At the same time, Kipling was a guy who had great insights into human nature. And when I started out writing the history, I knew right away that I wanted to do the history in two books. One book would be the early history, and one book would be the modern history. And so the book, the title Strength of the Wolf, is about the old history of the Bureau of Narcotics, when men were men and women were glad of it, when individuality really counted for how the business was operated. And then the Strength of the Pack, which begins in 1968, is when the war on drug becomes bureaucratized, and an individual initiative is less important than the bureaucratic means of organizing this exercise an empire on behalf of the United States, and so the phrase served me in that way as well. It illustrated how the war on drugs really is a bureaucratic exercise, including using secrecy, and not letting people know what's really going on, and the role of bureaucracy in concealing what the government's doing. And then the third reason for it is when I was actually doing the research, I met a bunch of really interesting people. The federal narcotic agents are more interesting than CIA officers.
Oh,
These were guys that nobody had ever written about before. And they really are more like us than CIA officers are, the old federal narcotic agents. The CIA, when I interviewed hundreds of CIA officers, I never interviewed a black CIA officer. It was very rare that I found a Jewish or a Puerto Rican CIA officer. I mean, these guys were representative of the Anglo-American elite, the CIA guys, or they came out of Texas and had played football for Texas A&M or something like that. They were almost exclusively all white guys. But when you get into the Bureau of Narcotics, it was like what America really looks like. There were black agents all over the place because they needed black agents to make cases on black guys in Harlem. And in order to have an undercover agent go into Harlem, you needed a black guy. And they had Jewish agents and these were guys right out of the east side of New York City who could, go into Jewish neighborhoods. I mean, and they were Jewish and nobody would notice them. There were Puerto Rican guys, just the whole spectrum across the board at the same time. And they all talked like in the vernacular of their own ethnicity. So it became a book that was a cross-section of America and introduced a new cast of characters onto the American historical stage. So it was very interesting for me from that point of view to be able to meet these guys. And most of them hated the CIA because the CIA was always impeding their cases. And so they loved talking about the CIA in negative terms and criticizing it and helping you to understand how the national security state was always impeding their cases. And they really, until you get to 1968 and the whole thing changes and becomes bureaucratized, the old agents gave me lots of insights into the CIA and how the CIA was involved in limiting the ability of these agents to make cases. And one of the agents I talked with was a very famous agent named Frankie Waterman. And he was an Irish guy from New York. He'd been in the Coast Guard for a while. And he became one of the most important, what's called case-making agents in New York City. He joined the Bureau of Narcotics in 1956. And actually was the agent who was instrumental in making the French Connection case. It's in the book, okay? And I was interviewing him early on in my research, and he said, and on my desk, I had the Kipling quote. The strength of the wolf is in the pack, and the strength of the pack is in the wolf. And it illustrated what being a federal narcotic agent was all about. You had to be an individual. You needed to really be an individual and exercise judgment and initiative and courage. And to be a case-making agent, you had to step out of the rules and the regulations. The only way you could make I mean, remember him telling me the only way you could make a case on a major mafioso was to put 5 kilograms of heroin in his trunk of his car. And he said you'd open up the trunk to the car and you'd say, where did this come from? And the guy would say, it wasn't there this morning. And you say, well, it's there now. And that's how they could make cases on major mafioso, because you would never hear a major mafioso say over wiretap, buy 5 kilograms of heroin. They had the system, the criminals had the organization set up so that the top guys could never be connected to the crime of narcotic trafficking. And at the same time, he said they needed to the case-making agents needed to rely on each other. When somebody would come after a federal narcotic agent, they would get together their goon squad, the pack of case-making agents. And they would go over to wherever this guy was hanging out, the social club or wherever, and they would beat the crap out of him and all his buddies. And they would teach him, you can't mess around with us. So they had, it was a way of functioning, and they had a lexicon, a way of talking about things with aphorisms, patterns of speech that I did not come across when I was interviewing people for the CIA. They were all very regimented and talking the same way, but the federal narcotic agents were just a thrill and a fast, from a literary point of view, to talk to all these guys and be able to record them and their speech patterns and put it out there for people to understand. It gives form. Talking with these old federal agents, drug agents, gives far more insights into what it means to be an American than ever talking to a CIA officer, which is some of them can be very interesting, but they just aren't as representative. So for all those reasons, I chose the title.
Great. It sounds like the FBI, the FBN agents were nowhere near as circumspect, looking over their shoulder to make sure they don't get criticized or say the wrong word or maybe let something slip that their bosses would drop the hammer on them for. Whereas the FBN guys are a kind of a lot more like somebody that's, I don't know, trying to work his way into a very complicated system, but finds that you have to work around things and do like you just spoke of, actually plant drugs on somebody if your mission is to actually bust them. You used the term strength of the wolf, and I'm sure you had some individuals in mind when you think of these wolves. Let's go back to the first book, Strength of the Wolf, and say, tell us about one of your wolves. Who do you think would be a good characteristic for the wolf image in your first book here, Strength of the Wolf?
An undercover agent, a guy who can, for example, I interviewed a lot of undercover agents, and in the old Bureau of Narcotics, there were never more than 300 agents around the world. 90 of them were in New York City, 60 to 90 of them in New York City. There were not a lot of agents in the Bureau of Narcotics. I mean, very, very few. Cities like New Orleans had one guy, 2 guys. Miami had 1 or 2 guys before the cocaine explosion in the 1960s started flooding Miami with drugs. There was only 1 or 2 agents down there. Most of them were in New York City trying to make cases on the mafia and the French Connection. Okay. So it's a very thinly dispersed group. And a guy who's all alone in an office in, say, Buffalo or Cleveland had to perform all the different functions. He had to be an administrator. He had to talk to cops. He had to talk to politicians. Plus, he had to go undercover. And to go undercover, you're all on your own. If you're going into an Irish mob, you're an Irish guy who goes in and you act like you're one of them. You act like a criminal. You do criminal things. You actually deal drugs with them. You become, you sell drugs. You have an informant. You have to run informants. You get an informant that tries to get you into the group. You had to do everything across the board. It's like CrossFit training. I had to do everything. By the time the pack comes along, everything is very, very compartmentalized. You have intelligence officers by the time, starting after 1968. You actually have intelligence branch, you have operations branch, you have administrative branch. But in the old days, a guy did everything. And most importantly, was undercover work, which is tremendously dangerous. You're putting your life on the line all the time. And you have to be able to lie and steal and cheat in a very charming way to get away with it. You actually have to pretend that you are a criminal. You have to behave and act like a criminal. And you have to deal drugs. A lot of these guys would actually shoot narcotics in their arm to prove that they were reliable. So they had absolutely no restrictions. And that to me is what a wolf is. A wolf is a guy who can do everything on his own. And there's nobody at headquarters saying, do it this way, do it that way. You go out, they say, go somewhere and do what you think you got to do. And that's what a wolf is. And the wolf goes out and he does it the way he thinks he should do and relies on his own intelligence and courage and abilities to lie, cheat, and steal, which then eventually becomes the credo for this organization. It becomes glorified the same way that Kipling glorified imperialism. The ability to lie and steal and cheat then becomes the way that the bureaucracy itself operates. It becomes guys start writing reports, and in a report, this guy Frankie Waters was explaining to me how report writing worked at the Bureau of Narcotics. And he said, I have a guy, and he seizes the critical piece of evidence for a case, heroin or a gun or something, okay? But the guy can't testify in court. When he gets in front of a bunch of people, he starts sputtering, and he's not very good in a courtroom. So I have one guy on my squad who's very good at testifying at court. So when I write up my report, who do you think I had seize this piece of evidence?
Mm-hmm.
The guy who's a great undercover agent but can't testify, or the guy who can testify. So report writing, in order to make cases, becomes part of this. There are no rules, there are no regulations. You just manipulate the situation to make the cases against these people. And that ethic, eventually, and the use of propaganda within the bureaucracy to create divisions, social divisions, to manipulate political and social movements within the United States, actually became the way the organization itself behaved. Okay, now that's a very complicated process and procedure, but it has to do with how the Bureau of Narcotics played on divisions, social divisions, and political divisions within the United States in order to make cases, until eventually, and the way, for example, huge amounts of heroin, morphine, and opium were coming into the United States from the Golden Triangle, which is this area of Asia just south of China, in Burma, Thailand, and Laos. Okay, and starting after World War II, even before World War II, huge amounts of opium and heroin and morphine base were coming into the United States from this area, where the CIA was setting up base in order to fight China. And all the reports that were written up by the top management in the Bureau of Narcotics said the drugs were coming from China, from communist China. And these guys, the top executives of the Bureau of Narcotics, would testify in front of Congress. And they would say, we got all these narcotics from communist China. And when they were actually really coming from the CIA's clients, the Kuomintang in Burma, the Thais in Thailand, the Laotians who were funding their insurgencies against communist China through the opium trade. And the CIA was running the whole business with this idea that you could fabricate reports, that you could plant evidence. It became the way the whole organization operated, to the point that they were lying to Congress. And they were telling Congress in every report that the drugs were coming from communist China. They did that for over 25 years. And until it got to the point where it affected all of American foreign policy, which again goes back to the days of Rudyard Kipling and problems that the United States was having in trying to enforce its kind of prohibitionism about drugs on the American people, and the need to blame a foreign country for the narcotic problem in the United States when the problem was actually being created by its own secret services in the interests of empire. It's very complex, but I track it all from the beginning, from 1919 right up to 2000, and how it evolves, and how the people that are running the war on drugs are, certainly aware of everything that I'm telling you about, and how they manipulated the perceptions of the American people in order to be able to wage this war on drugs, make it appear as if they were doing it for the benefit of the American people, when actually they were just doing it for the benefit of the very rich people who rule the country. And how the war on drugs becomes an apparatus, an adjutant to the national security interests of the United States. And how it all goes back to this very early days of needing to, what was called create a crime, to create a crime in order to make a drug case.
You divided your study in around, I guess, 1968, where the two books meet. Am I right about that? That it's right about that time that the wolves no longer are ruling, and that now you need the pack and all of the bureaucracy that you've just described. And I think it's curious that your book TDY, which we investigated a couple of times together, falls on the occasion of 1967, which is right along that seam there. I wonder if you have an opinion whether the events that you recounted in TDY had any effect on the transition from the wolf over to the pack.
Absolutely. TDY was, it's a book about an Air Force photojournalist, a guy who's working on an air base in the Southwest, and he likes to go on TDY missions around the country and then come back to his base and write them up and put them in the magazine for everybody to read. And he gets assigned, he signs up for a top secret TDY experience, which, again, there was many reasons for me writing the book, and there's many meanings to the book, but it does occur at this critical moment when American soldiers are now, by 1967, there's 500,000 of them in South Vietnam. And in 1967, people are already writing about how all these soldiers are smoking pot and starting to shoot heroin while they're supposed to be fighting a war in South Vietnam. And they're wondering, where does the marijuana, where does the heroin come from? And the military itself was confronting a huge problem. It was destroying the morale of soldiers who, first of all, were fighting an unpopular war, and now they're up to their eyeballs in drugs the moment they're not out in the field. There's Vietnamese little kids, 10-year-old kids, who are peddling vials of really, really good heroin to them on the streets of Saigon. And it's becoming an epidemic, and the military is wondering, well, what the hell is going on? And that's what this TDY mission that this guy goes on is all about. They actually, the military itself knows that the CIA is managing what I call golden triangle industries. The whole drug trafficking industry in Burma, Thailand, and Laos, and into South Vietnam. And it had set up this apparatus immediately after World War II. And it's the same way, like I was telling you earlier, that you'll never hear a mafia boss say, go buy 5 kilograms of heroin. Well, you'll never hear a CIA officer say, go buy 5 kilograms of heroin. And it enables people like Al McCoy, who wrote the book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, to say, well, the CIA wasn't directly connected, which is absolutely BS. They were just running the whole business in this godfatherly kind of way where they had cutouts, established in between themselves and all the drug traffickers. But they did run it. And the military knew it was true. And the military wanted to get the goods on the CIA, so they organized this TDY mission, which occurs in early 1967, which is right at this transition point between Wolf and Pack. And they send this guy with a bunch of Army Airborne Rangers and some other technicians into Laos, where they actually film and record and get audio tape of the CIA doing a drug deal. And it's CIA mercenaries doing the deal. And they come back to the United States with this information, all of which is suppressed at an official level, because more important than controlling narcotics in the United States, which are all being funneled into black neighborhoods or being done by hippies or there's by despised junkies. It really wasn't considered as important to control addiction in the United States as it was to win the war in South Vietnam and to defeat communism, which, as we all know, never happened. But anyway, I'm absolutely convinced that TDY mission was one of the contributing factors to lifting this old Bureau of Narcotics out of the Treasury Department and increasing its workforce from 350 men in 1967 to 3,500 by 1969. And most of those people now, in 1967, the Bureau of Narcotics had 16 agents overseas, 16, and 3 of them were in Thailand. It never had an agent in Saigon to investigate where all the heroin goes, and that's not a mistake. That's what's known as mismanagement by design. They did not put agents into these countries because they did not want them to have to report on what was actually going on. But after this TDY mission, and by 1968, everybody in the United States knew that the CIA was controlling the flow of narcotics in this region of the world. And so they had to convert. They took the Bureau of Narcotics out of the Treasury Department and they put it in the Department of Justice, and they started infiltrating CIA officers into the new organization that was created, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And over the next year, CIA officers took over the new intelligence division, which was created in the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, to make sure that nobody who was overseas could actually report about CIA drug trafficking. I mean, it just infiltrated the intelligence division with CIA officers. They infiltrated CIA officers into every post around the world. They infiltrated, and a lot of these CIA officers were coming out of tours in Laos and South Vietnam. So they knew exactly what was going on. And they created special operations units in the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs to operate all over the globe. And they were actually working for the CIA, not for the DEA, which comes into existence in 1973. And this is how, and I write at length about how the CIA actually expanded this workforce from 350 guys until eventually by 1975, you have 600 DEA agents in New York City alone. And they're spread all around the world. And they're thoroughly controlled by the CIA at every level. And every report they write, like I was telling you earlier about report writing, gets filtered at the management level. And they have CIA guys reading the reports and rewriting them, just like Frankie Waters did back in 1956, 57, and 58. So it complies with the needs of the bureaucracy and the needs of the national security state. And that's how the whole war on drugs was perverted. And I should add, it's very important that after 50 years of us going through this BS here in the United States, every level in customs, in the Bureau, in the FBI, in every law enforcement, military, and security agency, nobody knows what's a myth and what's a fact anymore. The propaganda has just completely overwhelmed the American public. And the myths about what America is, as opposed to really what it really is, have become so confused that people don't even know anymore what a fact is. And it's all the result of this need by the security institutions to control the message that we receive. Just like Rudyard Kipling was writing propaganda for the British. This is what we're seeing at every stage of in every corner of American society, which is why people are so pit against each other. It's our rulers who are pitting us against each other, rather than having ever in the last 75 years told us the truth about anything. And now nobody knows anymore. And so the evolution of the war on drugs serves as a metaphor for everything that has happened to the United States in the last 7,500 years. And if you can understand that and how that transitioned, then you can understand everything that's going on right now. But it's not easy, and it's complex, and it's intellectual, and it involves all sorts of contradictory and complementary things that are going on.
I have two questions that occurred to me as you were talking. The first one was, what was let me put it this way. When you see this transition going on from the wolves, the guys that have the ability to just fashion the facts as they need to in order to make the case, to the global idea of we're going to totally control the message that the American people get by creating really what is false, a Bureau of Narcotics or a DEA that is fighting against the drug crime. But you also have the CIA, which is an agent of the same government, which is using drugs to advance what it considers to be more important, the idea of national security. You mentioned that everybody in the United States knew that it was the CIA that was running the drugs, but I didn't know it. And your average person on the street didn't know it. The people that are in the know, that have the background, they would know it. But why is it that America as a whole, we've never learned this? And that's why I think these books are so crucial, because if people don't read these books, they'll never know it. It's not told anywhere else. Walter Cronkite never told us about it, and nobody is going to tell us about it. But how did they get so powerful that they could completely run this 50-year scam on us, taking our kids away from us, addicting them to drugs right under our noses, right in front of us, right on television, and we let them do it? How could we let them do it, or how did they get away with it?
You know, people are corrupted by wealth and power. And as you go up the ladder into executive management of the people that control the United States, the rewards become larger and larger for being part of the pack. And the pack itself is a homogenous ideological thing. It's not, you can't get into the upper levels of management of our government, of our society, unless you conform to what these people have established as the way that their prerogatives as a part of our prerogatives for the rest of us. I mean, you realize that we have a class in this people who are billionaires, who fly around on private jets. I mean, they just don't have one private jet. They have fleets of private jets. They have yachts. They own houses, that are like palaces. People used to criticize Saddam Hussein for having palaces. There are this class of people, the billionaire or multimillionaire class. They have palaces all over the world, and they live it outside, apart from the rest of us. They're not connected to us in any way, shape, or form, and they don't give a flying F about what happens to us. And they know that the only way that they can control us with this immense power of wealth that they have is to not care about us and not care about average people. You didn't see any millionaires storming the Capitol. I mean, they don't have to do that. They already have their own ethic, their own kingdom set up around the world, whether it's Amazon or whether it's PayPal or whatever. There's a class of people who control this country and have empires that are invisible to us. They're only tangible to us in a sort of Rudyard Kipling mythical way, of like British royalty. That this is what these people are. There's something that we're told that we should aspire to become like, and that this is the way you should be and the way you should live. And these people don't care anything about us. And as long as we're fighting among ourselves, and as long as we're addicted to drugs, and as long as we do their bidding, like Kipling said, if they question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied. Well, these people are like our fathers, lying to us about everything all the time. And they laugh about it, that we believe the lies, and that we go along and we fight their wars for them, and we compete with each other, and we grovel for a minimum wage, or we grovel for the right to own a gun. There's just all sorts of things that they keep us focused on while they're ruling the world. And their propaganda machine is just ubiquitous, and their powers are omnipotent. And everybody who works in the government, who wants to work their way up into the executive management branches of the military, the CIA, the security services, if you want to be, the mayor of a big city, you gotta play their game. Otherwise, you're not going to go anywhere. And so the further up you get, the more you get integrated into this way of living, with the idea that if you aspire and you're ideologically pure enough, you'll become like them someday. And it's unfortunately not simple, but at the same time, it's a long way from the dog's nose to the tip of the dog's tail. And a lot of things go on. And in the 50 years since Nixon, that's what the ruling class has been working on, is establishing these bureaucracies in the government, in civil society, that in the tax records, the tax system, the justice system, that are like moats around their empires that protect them. And that is where they can concentrate all their energy. You're not going to necessarily see the Rockefellers as the governor of the state anymore, but they're certainly pulling the strings with the governors.
Well, that about puts it in a nutshell as best as anybody can. Thank you for that. May I indulge myself with one question about the TDY and about my dad, because we identified him in the book as the character Mr. Hammer. My question is this: based on what you just said, the military generally knew that it was the CIA that was doing these deals in Laos with the drug lord. I assume Vang Pao, or somebody working for Vang Pao in Laos at the time. But my question is this: would this have been my dad's idea, that he said, well, we got to catch these guys, and guys like your character, the major, would have said, yeah, let's go get them? Or would it have possibly come down from Melvin Laird, the Secretary of Defense at the time, to say to somebody like my dad, to say, hey, we got to do something to stop this CIA drug trafficking. Tom OLoughlin, can you work on a program we can catch him? Do you think it was him thinking of it himself, as his own morality, that came up with its TDY mission? Or do you think it was something that somebody higher than him would have said, hey, we got to stop this. So Tom, you figure out how to stop it. And he conceives the mission that way. You see what I'm saying?
Sure. And it's the same thing across the board everywhere. It doesn't mean that there aren't good people in America. It doesn't mean that there are honest, true people who are, want to do the right thing. It just means that these people can be manipulated to putting their lives on the line for an ideal about what America is. And at every point, the more power and the more knowledge these people get, they come to a critical point where their beliefs clash with the harsh reality of what's going on above them. I believe that happened to your father, that at one point he sat in the living room and displayed a moment where his beliefs had been shattered. He had come across some knowledge that had undermined his faith and his beliefs in what America really is. And that happens to everybody that I've ever spoken to who's been involved in either the CIA or the DEA or Customs or any of these branches. And at that moment of this crisis of values, people have to make choices. Do they say, well, it's a fine balance. We have a lot of freedoms here. Life is good here. So the people who are ruling us are actually not all bad. It's better here than it is in Laos. It's better here than it is in Vietnam. They make comparisons. They make judgments in which they say, well, I'm going to throw it in with these guys anyway because it's all relative. Or if they choose to go against what they know to be true, then they're kicked out. And there's now plenty of bureaucratic procedures that have been put in place, like non-disclosure statements, that if these people were to actually go out and tell what they know to be true, they would be put in prison. There's like an Official Secrets Act in the United States. And you sign on the dotted line when you go into these positions, the positions that for example, your father was in, or this major goes in, and they sign on the dotted line and they swear never to tell what they learned. And there's a reason for that, because what they learn is that it's all an illusion, and that the real, first of all Americans are not united in one noble endeavor, which is to do good to mankind, that there's an awful lot of Americans who are in it just for themselves, and that these people are also wolves, and they feast on the rest of us like lambs and sheep, and that in order to get to the tippy top, to become a billionaire, to be the kind of person who can have, let me just use a number, $50 billion, when at the same time 50 billion people in the United States are existing in poverty. You have to be a pretty cold-hearted bastard to be able to do that. And yet these are the people who rule the world, and they're the ones who make the rules. So when you get to that point, like the major or your father, and you realize that this is what's going on, there's a moment of cognitive dissonance where everything that you have believed up to that point is put on the line. And the CIA and the people who run our country hire thousands of psychiatrists and anthropologists and sociologists in order to be able to assuage people when they have these moments of crisis, and to be able to reintegrate them back into society without having gone through a crisis too bad of crisis of faith. I'll give you an example. The guy who went on this TDY mission was in the Air Force. Air Force pilots, and for example, they bombed Tokyo, they bombed Dresden, they dropped bomb on cities, they bombed Hanoi. The Air Force has a branch called its Human Factors Branch, which is concerned with two things. One, making sure that pilots who drop bombs on cities do not feel bad about it. And the other thing is making sure that the American population generally will receive these guys back into civilian society when they're done dropping bombs on cities, and welcome them as heroes, and never think for a minute about what the damage is that the bombs are doing. Okay, so people exist at all different levels of our society, of our culture, and the people that run the culture and our society are busy, like Rudyard Kipling, glorifying militarism, glorifying our Air Force pilots, just to use one example. Kipling would be glorifying them as the Imperial soldiers who went and conquered Mandalay in 1885. That they were great guys, a servant of the king. And to make sure that people would look at them and aspire to them, see them in a very human way, people with flaws, who they can attach to in a human way, but at the same time tipping the balance so that they're glorified. And of course, Kipling himself had a moment of crisis of values like this. His own son, John, wanted to go and fight in World War I. The guy was nearly blind. He was as blind as I am deaf. And the Navy wouldn't take him. And then the Army wouldn't take him. And finally, in 1914, pulling his strings, Kipling, who was a very, very influential guy in British society, got the Irish Guards to let his son, join as a lieutenant. And 1915, less than a year into the war, Rudyard Kipling's son was killed in the trenches. And the last that anybody saw him, he was stumbling around in the mud looking for his glasses with his face blown off. So when Kipling wrote that couplet, when they question why we died, tell them your fathers lied. He's talking about himself.
Yeah.
Okay? He lost his own son, sacrificed his own son on the altar of this propaganda. And people face these kind of personal, really wrenching kind of personal choices all the time. Frankie Waters, for example, getting back to this old case-making agent in New York City. So, he got divorced. He said, you can't be a case-making agent and have a wife and kids because you got to go out all night long to make cases. You got to do all sorts of really dastardly, dirty things. You got to be able to put 5 kilograms of heroin in a mafia boss's trunk. You got to break the laws every day of your life. You got to learn how to lie and steal and cheat. And it's the same thing. I mean, this is what I'm trying to tell you, that the people who rule us learn to lie and cheat and steal. And it becomes the ethic for them. And it becomes actually the ethics for what they do. And we're all victims of it. But they find rationalizations for it all along the way. And those rationalizations are turned into the myths that confuse us and make us ask questions about, well, how are the rich different from us? We try to live lives where we don't lie and steal and cheat. And yet for them, that's the way that they become rich. And at some point, sure, maybe there's a conflict for them. Maybe I had so many CIA officers whose kids became drug addicts. And they would be overseas for 20 years, and they would come home, and their kids would be addicts. And they would go, and they wouldn't be able to make the connection between what they had been doing for 20 years and what was happening to their kids. It's this cognitive dissonance. William Colby, who was running this drug empire from the time he became head of the CIA's Far East Asia Division in 1962, right up until the time he stopped being the director of Central Intelligence in 1975, ran this whole big operation. Well, his daughter, he came home and he was accused of running the Phoenix program. He was accused of running this big drug operation, and he defended and lied about everything all through his life. And his daughter died of suicide through anorexia nervosa because of what her father had done. And he stopped being a Catholic and divorced his wife and just continued to exist at this as a functionary of this rich political elite. So there's human beings are capable of sacrificing their own kids. All right? For power and money. And they do it all the time, from Rudyard Kipling to William Colby to people all across the board. And it's because, it's part of human nature.
Wow. It's a terrible verdict to hear from you, Doug Valentine, about our times today, which it looks to me like it hasn't gotten any better. And as a matter of fact, it's even gotten worse. As a kind of a last question, since I know I wanted to keep it to an hour. But my last question would be, what would you have?
Last question, John.
What could we do? What can we do now? I think one of the big things that we can do is to read Doug Valentine's books and to try to convince people that, hey, our rulers are corrupt. Our rulers are running this Hegelian dialectic, the good guys against the bad guys, and we're all being assigned parts in what really is nothing but a dramatic performance that involves us dying and them getting rich. What can we do, Doug? What's your advice to us that are still trying to pump some life back into the old republic and the Bill of Rights and our dreams of being a real good Americans?
Well, frankly, I don't know. Everybody has got to fight this battle individually, spiritually, within themselves. So the first thing you have to do, and it's really hard to do if you're working 40 hours a week, or if your livelihood has been taken away because of COVID and the pandemic, it becomes harder and harder all the time to actually find the time to absolve yourself as an individual of all your false assumptions about the times that we live in. It's a lot easier. And again, our rulers have legions of academics, all who want to get a bigger piece of the pie, that advise them how to manipulate us. Anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists. I mean, the best of them are on the payroll, and they're not interested in making life better for us. They're interested in making life better for them and getting up into the stratosphere. But you have to, as an individual, become knowledgeable about these things. Psychology, sociology, anthropology, all the things that are going on, and somehow absolve yourself and of all the false assumptions that you have about what's going on, and have almost, in a sense, like force yourself to a crisis of values as an individual, and force yourself to the kind of cathartic moment that your father had imposed upon him, or that the major had imposed upon them, where they actually find out that the government is corrupt, the government that they've been serving. Well, you have to, as an individual, get yourself to that point too. And you have to be prepared for that moment. And when it arrives, you have to have a spiritual foundation. You have to have substance, the substance within yourself, to exist as an individual and to sustain yourself and as an individual, relying only on your own understanding of the world as it is, and not have to need to be associated with a particular faction that's fighting with another faction. You got to be able to stand alone and to face this thing as an individual, devoid of any illusions. And that's really, really, really hard, because like I said, the Air Forces and the Army and the Navy, they're all piling on all this propaganda to us every minute of every day. And it's really hard to shed all that stuff and to just become a true spirit. and especially in these times where we're being manipulated into opposing groups. And even, families are being torn apart by what's going on right now. And when you start seeing family units disintegrating because of this, things have gotten really bad. And when brothers are fighting each other over the most superficial bullshit, and you see the whole fabric of the country being torn apart, how do you get to each individual and encourage them to really shed all, to undo all this from themselves and stand apart from all this stuff? It's really hard, but and it gets harder every day. It was easier 100 years ago to be an individual, and it's getting harder and harder all the time. But that's the only way this problem can be overcome, is each person individually.
Well, that's a great way to launch ourselves back into the real world and leave our very, very exciting and stimulating conversation with Doug Valentine to kind of have a call to ourselves, individuals, as individuals, to maintain and to seek the real self inside of you, the person that is genuine, it is real, it does have morality. And boy, so many times we see in our lives that people that don't have morality are the ones that win. But in fact, I think they're the ones that lose, because you end up with your kids addicted to heroin. You end up leading an inauthentic life. You live by lying. And of course, that is destructive, not only to yourself, but to the people around you, your family, your community, and your country. So, Doug Valentine, I can't thank you enough for your time this morning and your wisdom and sharing it with us. Folks, get Doug Valentine's books from dougvalentine.com, and keep in touch with Doug at his website, as I'm sure that he will be continuing to issue his.
Always a pleasure to talk with you, John.
Oh, Doug, thank you so much. And we'll let you go now. Everybody, thanks for being here with us, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks again, Doug Valentine. Bye now. Bye, Doug.
Okay, bye-bye.